The kind of tired that Preston Hale carried into the new year was not the kind that went away with sleep. It had settled in sometime around the third winter after Mara died. Not all at once, but gradually, the way a house settles into its foundation without anyone noticing until a door stops closing right. He would wake at 5:15, before the alarm, and lie there for a few minutes in the dark, listening to the pipes and the wind off Lake Ontario, and feel the specific weight of a life that was being held together mostly by routine and stubbornness. He was 41. He had a daughter named Becca, who was 7, and who left her shoes in the middle of the hallway without fail, and who asked questions about stars and beetles, and why people cried at weddings, with a seriousness that sometimes stopped him cold in the middle of making her lunch. He had a 1994 Ford pickup that ran because he kept it running, and not for any other reason. He had a job at Kovacs Industrial on the east side of Hamilton, where he had worked as a heavy equipment mechanic for going on 14 years, and he was, without any real argument available on the other side, the best one they had. What he did not have was a degree. He had a Red Seal certification, a millwright ticket, a trade diploma from the college, and the kind of practical knowledge that took a decade of getting it wrong before you got it right. He had rebuilt a rotary screw compressor from memory once when the manual was unavailable and the plant was losing $12,000 an hour. He had done it in 4 hours and 40 minutes, but the certificate on the wall of the plant manager's office still said what it said, and Preston's file still said what it said. And the two things did not talk to each other the way they should have. He did not complain about this. It wasn't that he had accepted the unfairness of it so much as he had decided, at some point, that complaining cost energy he did not have. He had Becca's lunches to make, and Becca's school schedule to track, and the persistent leak under the kitchen sink, and the annual anxiety of whether the truck would start in February. The question of what he deserved versus what he had was a question he had learned to leave sitting on the counter unanswered. On a Thursday in late January, Preston finished a double shift at Kovacs. They had a milling machine down and no one else on the floor could locate the fault, and stopped at a pub on Barton Street on the way home. Not to drink exactly. He had one beer. Sometimes, when the kind of tired he was carrying needed 15 minutes of somewhere that was not the shop and not the house, before he could make the transition between them. The pub was called the Anchor, and it was not a nice pub, but it was a familiar one, and familiar was enough. He sat at the bar and ordered a Sleeman and looked at his phone without reading anything on it, which was the thing he did when he was too tired to actually want information, but needed something to do with his hands. Around him, the pub had its usual Thursday population. A couple of men from the construction trades near the window, a younger crowd toward the back, the television above the bar playing a hockey recap that no one was watching. He became aware of the situation at the table to his left, not because of anything dramatic, but because of the absence of something. He had been, without meaning to, half listening to the couple at that table. A woman in her mid-40s, composed and clearly professional even in her posture, and a man Preston's age or a little older who had been talking at a volume slightly too large for the room. What he became aware of was that her voice had dropped, and then stopped, and then the man's voice had continued regardless, and there was a quality to the silence on her side that Preston recognized. Not fear. Something more specific than that. The fixed expression of someone who is calculating how to exit a situation that has gone wrong in a way that cannot be corrected. He didn't look directly. He ordered a second beer he didn't particularly want and kept his eyes on the television. The man. Preston had heard the bartender call him Kevin, was leaning forward now with the particular posture of someone who confuses proximity with persuasion. His voice had taken on the flat, pressurized quality of someone accustomed to getting what he asked for and running low on patience. Preston heard him say, quietly enough that no one else at the bar would catch it, that she was being oversensitive, and that she had seemed like a different kind of person online. Preston set his glass down and looked at the condensation ring it left on the bar. He was not, by nature, an interfering person. His general approach to conflict was avoidance, and his general approach to strangers was politeness followed by neutrality. He was aware that what he was considering doing could go badly in several directions, and that none of those directions were his business. He thought about Becca at home with Mrs. Osei from next door, and he thought about the shift at 7 in the morning, and he thought about the beer he hadn't finished. Then he looked at the woman's hands, which were flat on the table, with the stillness of someone who has already decided to stop reacting, and he stood up. He walked over to the table and did not do anything theatrical. He did not raise his voice or put his hand on anything. He looked at the woman and said, the way you might say it to someone you'd been trying to meet up with for a week and finally managed to track down, that he was sorry he was late, that the traffic on the link had been impossible tonight. The man, Kevin, looked up at him with the expression of someone reassessing the room. Preston held it steady. He wasn't aggressive and he wasn't apologetic, and he kept his attention on the woman in a way that offered her something without insisting on it. She took it, she said, smoothly enough that Preston thought she must be a person who had navigated difficult moments before, that it was fine, these things happened. Kevin said that they were in the middle of something. Preston said, still very calmly, that he could see that, and that he was sorry to interrupt, but they had somewhere they needed to be, and he looked at the woman and not at Kevin when he said it. There was a moment, the kind that determines what kind of moment it was. Kevin put his glass down and said something under his breath that Preston didn't fully catch and didn't try to, and then he picked up his jacket from the back of the chair and left. The woman let out a breath that was not quite a laugh. They stood there for a moment in the awkward residue of the thing, and she thanked him, and he said it was nothing, which was not entirely true but was the right thing to say. She offered to buy him a drink and he said no, genuinely, because he had an early start, she said. She hoped he had a good night and he said the same and went back to the bar and finished his beer and left. He did not think about it very much on the drive home. He thought about the milling machine, and whether he had documented the fix properly, and about whether Becca had eaten her vegetables at dinner. He thought about the leak under the sink. By the time he pulled into the driveway, the evening at the Anchor had already receded into the category of things that had happened, which was a large and largely unexamined category in Preston Hale's life. The thing about the job at Sievert Engineering was that he hadn't been looking for it. The posting had found him, technically. A man named Dale from his millwright program 20 years ago had sent him a link with a short message that said you should apply, they're doing serious work. Preston had looked at the posting for several days before doing anything about it. The role was a senior maintenance systems specialist, which was a title that meant nothing on its own, but which described, in the specifics, exactly the work Preston had been doing for over a decade. The salary was significantly better than what he was making at Kovacs. There was a benefits package. There were pension contributions. The posting mentioned, toward the end, that candidates with equivalent demonstrated experience would be considered alongside those with formal engineering credentials. He had read that last sentence 3 times. He applied on a Sunday evening after Becca was asleep, at the kitchen table, with the overhead light on and the sound of the upstairs radiator ticking. He wrote the cover letter carefully and honestly, which was the only way he knew how to write anything, and he did not try to make himself sound like something he wasn't. He described what he knew how to do and what he had done, and he submitted it, and he did not expect much. They called him for an interview 10 days later. The morning of the interview, he drove Becca to school, and she asked him why he was wearing his good shirt on a Thursday, and he told her he had a meeting. She asked if he was nervous, and he said a little, and she told him, with the gravity of a person who has given this matter serious thought, that people usually liked him once they met him, so it would probably be fine. He thanked her, and the earnestness of it sat with him the whole drive across the city. Sievert Engineering occupied the upper 2 floors of a building in a business park off the 403. The reception area was clean and understated in the way that signals a company that does not feel the need to perform its own importance. Preston arrived 8 minutes early, checked in with the receptionist, and sat in a chair by the window with his folder of documents on his knee. He was not good at waiting, but he was practiced at it. A few minutes before 10, a door opened at the far end of the reception area, and a woman came out of it and stopped. He recognized her at the same moment she recognized him, and they both held very still for a beat in the way of people whose mental categories have just been rearranged without warning. She was the woman from the anchor. She was dressed differently, of course. She had been in a dark coat Thursday night, and now she was in a blazer with the particular ease of someone who wore one daily. But the recognition was immediate and mutual, and there was nothing to do about it but proceed through it. She walked across the reception area to where he was sitting and extended her hand, and said that she was Claudine Beaumont, Director of Operations, and that she would be leading his interview today. He stood and shook her hand and said his name, which she already knew from his file, and for a moment neither of them said anything about the other thing. She led him back through the door and down a short hallway and into a boardroom where 2 other people were already seated. A man in his 50s, who was introduced as the HR manager, Alan, and a younger woman who was introduced as Petra from the technical team. Claudine took the chair at the head of the table and set a copy of his resume in front of her without looking at it. Preston sat across from them and put his folder on the table and did not take anything out of it. The interview was the structured behavioral kind that he had encountered once before, years ago, at a company he hadn't got the job with. The questions were not, "What would you do?" but "Tell me about a time when." He answered them the way he did most things, directly and without embellishment, describing situations that had actually happened, giving credit to the people around him when it was accurate to do so, and not when it wasn't. He talked about the compressor. He talked about a scaffold failure he had identified 2 years ago that had been written off as a structural issue and turned out to be a maintenance failure with a clear causal chain. He talked about the way he documented his work and why he documented it the way he did. He could tell, from the way Alan's pen moved, that some of what he was saying was landing. About 40 minutes in, Claudine set down her own pen and looked at him for a moment. She said that she wanted to ask him something slightly outside the formal structure of the interview. She said that she noticed his application had referenced equivalent experience in lieu of formal credentials, and she asked if he could speak to what that meant for him. Practically, he said that what it meant was that he had done the work for 14 years, and he had the record to show for it, and that he had always believed the work would speak for itself, and that he was aware that was not always how decisions were made, but that it was what he had. She nodded and wrote something he couldn't read. Then she looked at him, and the room did something subtle, shifted slightly, or maybe just became more present, and she said that she had one more question, and that it was personal, and that he was welcome to decline to answer it. He said, "Go ahead." She said that she had been thinking, since Thursday, about something, and she asked, not with any drama, just a quiet and practical curiosity, that if he had known, before he came over to that table, who she was, what her company was, that there was an interview the next morning, what he would have done. The HR manager looked up from his notes. Petra was very still. Preston thought about the question honestly, the way he thought about all questions, which was to follow it back to where it started. He said that he had noticed she wanted to leave and couldn't find the door, so to speak, and that the only decision he had made was whether to make himself useful or to finish his beer. He said he hadn't known anything about her beyond that, and that if he had, he didn't think it would have changed what was in front of him to decide. He said he supposed you could plan for a lot of things, but you couldn't really plan for that kind of moment. You either did the thing Or you didn't, and he had decided to do it, and the rest of it wasn't something he had thought about. The room was quiet for a moment after that. Claudine said thank you. Alan made a note. Petra looked at her own hands and then back up. The call came 11 days later on a Wednesday morning, while Preston was under a conveyor belt housing at Kovacs with a flashlight in his teeth. He felt his phone vibrate in his chest pocket and ignored it, and then climbed out and saw it was a Hamilton number he didn't recognize and called it back. It was Alan from Sievert, who told him, in the measured and professional tone of someone delivering good news they've delivered before, that they were pleased to offer him the position. Preston sat down on the side of an equipment pallet and listened to the rest of the call. He said he would review the offer letter and get back to them by end of week, which was the correct thing to say, even though he already knew what his answer was going to be. He sat there for a moment after he hung up. The shop floor moved around him, the pressure of a grinder somewhere, the rolling clatter of a parts trolley, two of the younger mechanics talking across the aisle about something. The overhead lights were the particular yellow of fluorescence that had been running for 20 years, and the air smelled like hydraulic fluid and cold concrete, which was a smell he associated, without sentiment but without bitterness, with the better part of his adult life. He thought about Becca asking him if he was nervous and telling him people usually liked him once they met him. He thought about Mara, the way he sometimes did in moments that would have meant something to her, not with the old ache, exactly, but with a kind of low and steady recognition that she was not there, and that the moments kept happening anyway, and that this was both a loss and a testament to something he didn't have a precise name for. He put his phone back in his chest pocket and picked up the flashlight and went back to work. He gave 2 weeks' notice at Kovacs and said nothing about where he was going, because it wasn't relevant, and because he was a private person, in the specific way of people who have learned that sharing things too early gives others the opportunity to diminish them. His supervisor, a man named Frank, who was not a bad person, and not a particularly thoughtful one either, said he was sorry to lose him and that he hoped the new place appreciated what they were getting. Preston said he appreciated that and meant it, and finished out his 2 weeks without ceremony. His first week at Sievert, he was given a tour of the facility by Petra, who turned out to be an exceptionally precise and technically capable person who asked him real questions and listened to his answers as though she intended to use them. He liked her immediately in the measured way he liked people, quietly, provisionally, with the intention of revising the assessment as more information became available. He crossed paths with Claudine Beaumont 3 times that week, in hallways and once briefly in the kitchen, and each time they exchanged the professional courtesy of 2 people who work in the same building and have a shared history that is not the kind of history the building knows about. On Friday afternoon, she stopped him in the corridor outside his office and asked how the first week had gone, and he said honestly that he thought he was going to like it there. She said she was glad and that she had a sense he was going to be useful. He said he hoped so, that was all. It was exactly the right amount. That Friday, he picked Becca up from school, and she wanted to stop at the park on the way home, even though it was February, and the play structure was covered in a hard crust of ice that made the slide dangerous and the ladder treacherous. He stood at the bottom of it in his good coat and watched her navigate it with total confidence and no apparent awareness of the risk, and she made it down the slide intact and landed in a puff of snow at the bottom, and looked up at him and said, "See, Dad," in the voice of someone who has just proved a point she had not quite got around to making yet. He said that he saw. He had not told her about the new job in detail. She was 7, and the particulars of maintenance systems engineering were not her primary interest. But he had told her he had got it, the night of the call, at dinner. She had asked if it was a good one and he had said yes. She had said, "Told you they'd like you," and returned to her macaroni with the efficiency of someone who considers a closed matter closed. He stood at the bottom of the icy play structure on a cold Friday in February and watched her climb back up again. The winter light was doing the particular thing it did in southern Ontario in February, where it came in, low and thin, and turned everything it touched the color of old brass. Becca's jacket was red, which was her requirement, and had been for 2 years, and it was very bright against the white of the snow and the gray of the sky, and Preston stood there watching her, and felt something that was not quite happiness, and not quite relief, but was the closest available thing to both. He had not set out to be the kind of person who did what he had done in that pub. He had not been trying to arrange anything, or position himself for anything. He had looked at a woman who needed a door and decided to be the door. And everything else had followed from that in the way that things sometimes follow from small, unremarkable decisions that turn out to matter. He thought about that, briefly, in the winter light. Then Becca called down to him to watch, and he watched.